Associate Collections Curator here at York Museums Trust, and welcome to our Facebook Live event. We're going to be doing a curator's talk on the site of Starcar, the Mesolithic mystery. So, throughout the talk I'm going to introduce a little bit about the history, the geography of the site, and the amazing archaeological collections that you can see here in the Yorkshire Museum. So, the story of the site starts at the end of the last ice age, the last glacial maximum, between 15 and 12,000 years ago. During the Ice Age, obviously these parts of the British Isles were covered in sheets of ice and glaciers. As these started to recede, this created a whole new environment around the site of Starcar. So it created a lake. So hopefully you'll be able to see a map which comes up on your screen. And this map, to situate yourself, so this is the coastal edge of North Yorkshire, just above the border with East Yorkshire. So you have Scarborough in the top right-hand corner, Filey's in the middle, and Flamborough Head's down in the bottom right-hand side, just outside of it. Right in the middle of that, there's a big black splotch. So this is about 4 kilometres in length, and that is the Paleo Lake Flixton. So it was created by the receding glaciers at the end of the Ice Age. It's a Paleo lake, so it no longer exists. It dissipated several thousand years after it came into being. And the site of Starcar is based on the western edge, so the left-hand side of the lake, as you can see it in that map. Now, if I just look behind me, we have a reconstruction of a mural here in the gallery of the Yorkshire Museum, where you can hopefully at least get a sense of the scale of this sort of lake. So if I was stood here on the lake foreshore, it goes off several miles into the distance. You know, it's a big significant body of water. Now the site of Starcar is a small settlement that's based on the dry land just above the edge of the lakeshore. So it's, so the site, where it is on the lakeshore, this is in the Mesolithic period. Okay, so the Mesolithic is the middle Stone Age. We have the Old Stone Age, the Paleolithic, and the New Stone Age, the Neolithic. Between these two sits. The Mesolithic is roughly 9,000 to 4,000 BC here in Britain, and it is typified by some fundamental changes in technological developments. So as those ice sheets receded up the island, up Britain, there were new species of animal and plants that started to recolonize the area within it. So how the Mesolithic differentiates to the Paleolithic is particularly that there's the introduction of big game animals. So we have elk, there are roe deer, red deer, wild boar, and these are different to the sort of wild horses that may have been hunted in the Upper Paleolithic before this period. There's also different plant species that turn up, and these changes heralded developments in technology, particularly in the use of lithic tools and stone tools, in the use of wood for creating the use of those stone tools to create antler and wooden tools as well, and the exploitation of them together. And these sort of technological developments really define the Mesolithic period. So the site that we have at Starcar was excavated in 1948 by a chap called John Moore. He was an amateur archaeologist. He discovered the site. He then told the great and good of the archaeological community, and the first major excavations were from 1949 to 1951 by Sir Graham Clark. There's a more recent phase of excavations by the University of York, led by Professor Nicky Milner, and I mention these because I'm going to refer to some of these two different sites. So the Clark excavations really established Starcar as the Mesolithic type site. So it's a word that we use in archaeology. That means our fundamental understanding of this period of the Mesolithic is based on this site in Britain. So everything becomes compared to Starcar. It really is that important. The modern excavations by the University of York have really solidified the importance of the site and made some new discoveries that help us interpret it to a much greater nuance. Okay, so this site at the edge of the lakeshore and just up on the dry land, it dates between 9,335 to about 8,440 BC. So this is more than 10,000 years old. That is an 800-year period in the Mesolithic, at the very earliest phase of the Mesolithic period. The site was unlikely to have been inhabited continually for 800 years. There's probably sporadic different periods of use of the site, and then its abandonment later on. The site is important for, it has two particular architectural features that help us identify it. Firstly, there is some structures, so there's buildings, dwellings. The largest of these is 3.5 meters wide in diameter, and it's got a series of post holes and a big ring around the outside of it. These post holes are all about 20 centimeters in diameter, so fairly substantial, and this probably created something like a teepee-like structure, and there are several of these around the site. So they may have been covered with animal skins or with other plants or material from the forests, or they may have changed over their lifetime as well. Inside the largest of these, there's botanical remains on the floor have identified that there was reeds and there were mosses, particularly centralized in the center of the dwellings. So we know it's basically carpeted. It's quite a comfortable place to have lived in the Mesolithic period. The second architectural feature that's very important here is sort of a platform, like a jetty, which extends from the dry land out into the lake. And it goes on several feet, so people could kind of access that transition from the land site right onto the lake itself. Starcar becomes very important because of the preservation of organic materials. So we've got another image that can come up on your screen here, in which you'll be able to see a series of, so this is wood, so this is part of the wooden platform, but you can see that there's multiple layers of wood that are stacked upon each other. All of that wood is nearly 10,000 years old. This is a really incredible state of preservation. It's really unusual to be able to find this stuff of this age and this sort of archaeological context. You may be able to see from the left-hand side of the picture that kind of the whole depth of the trench. So this isn't that far from the modern ground surface anymore. It's a really, so it's a minimally excavated site. It's very low in the ground. But that amount of organic material, as it survives under there, has helped us understand the importance of this site. And through that, I'm going to introduce you to some of the objects from the site and why they are relevant here. So I'm going to start with this. So this isn't from Starcar, but this is a big lump of flint. It's a flint nodule. It's from our geological collection. You're probably quite familiar with flint. You've certainly heard the name. It is a stone. It is particularly found in, you'll find it on the Yorkshire coast and all across arable land across the region. It's very hard, it's very durable. When you find it raw, for example, as pebbles, it might have a different color to it. So this has got a white surface to it. This is a cortex, basically sort of crust. And then flint is also very brittle. So if it's struck with an implement, usually a rounded stone, it fractures in a certain way, revealing on the inside this really dark grey colour. This is typical of some of the North Yorkshire flints. That act of striking it, of breaking the flint nodule, one of the properties of flint is because it's brittle, it creates a naturally smooth surface on the underside of the flake that breaks and a really sharp edge to it. So it just creates really sharp tools very simply. It's not a complicated technology at all. So within the Mesolithic, some of these large chunks that have been worked off get worked into smaller pieces. So this is what we call a core. So you'll be able to see there are some little vertical planes in here. So these are where some Mesolithic tools have been cut off it. It's been struck, and things this sort of size are removed from that larger core. This is a microlith, a tiny, literally a small stone, but this is typical of Mesolithic technologies. Rather than large single-handed tools, we get these little microliths are created, so it's got a sharp edge on this side within it. The opposite side, you'd be able to see it's been worked down further, so it has almost these like tiny little teeth. It's almost serrated on the side of it, and it's nice and smooth on the underside from where it's hit. Now, microliths aren't used on their own. They were used in bundles, so you might get lots of them and haft them onto the top of an arrowhead or a spearhead, and this, along with the creation of barbs as a technological development, is really useful for hunting the large wild game which would have surrounded the lakeside itself. So this leads us on to our second object, which is from Starcar. So this thing is more than 10,000 years old. This is antler. It's a barbed point. So you can see you've got these really vicious barbs all along one face of it. Some of them are still quite sharp. And the back end of it would have been hafted, so it would have had a long pole that would have attached to it. And this is exactly the sort of thing that you use to hunt wild game, or even out into the lake to try and catch fish as well. It is that development of the technology that is typical of the Mesolithic. This stuff didn't exist before. And so this is one of the early sites that we can find. These sorts of objects are really actually quite common from Starcar, but they aren't common in many other places, in particular from the excavations by Graham Clark. And his excavations ended up in being spread across multiple sites. So there's some here in the Yorkshire Museum, and there's some also in Scarborough, in the British Museum, and the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology in Cambridge, and they have lots of this sort of similar technology as well. We're just going to take a quick walk over to the case on here. So from a development in technology, so the creation of these new sorts of tools, we have what is probably the most famous objects that come from Starcar, and that's these here in the small case inside the large case. We're not going to get them out today because they're very fragile. But these are antler frontlets, sometimes called headdresses. The largest one in the middle still has the antlers that are attached to it. You can see that they've been cut in half all the way down them. And it's that sort of splitting of antler is the exact sort of raw material that would have been used to create the barbed point that I've just shown you on the table. Now, so there are 4 in this case. The 3 largest at the front are all red deer, and the small one is roe deer. So we have 2 different species of deer being exploited here. Now, what they are is part of the cranium, as you can imagine. So it's the top of the skull. And these deer skulls are clad in clay. They're put into a fire, and all the areas that have been clad don't get burned. So that's the bits that survive. All the burnt bone can get removed with the stone tools, and it creates this sort of object. Now, there are 2 main theories to what these things were for. Firstly, that they may have been some sort of camouflage that's used in hunting. So this is a hunter-gatherer sort of lifestyle that's happening at Starcar in the 8th millennium BC, 9th millennium BC. And wearing one of these headdresses, particularly one of the ones with large antlers, there's a little bit of experimental archaeological work that suggests it makes it easier to get close to female deer. So it might actually have been a sort of hunting camouflage. The second one, it may not necessarily have been mutually exclusive, but it also could have formed some sort of ritual function. Now, we have a 3D printed model here of the one in the front of the case on here. So this one, the antlers have been shed before it had been turned into a frontlet. But if I turn it upside down, you get, so this is the interior of the brain case of the animal, but there's natural concavity to it. Lends itself to being attached to the top of the human head. So any of these large ones here may in fact have been worn right on the top. So just like that. So for hunting or for ritual purposes, these things could have been worn by people who lived in Starcar. Now, the reason that we can find these things in such incredible condition is not just because they were buried in the ground, but because they were very carefully deposited at the edge of that lake. The edge of the lake doesn't exist anymore, but archaeologically we can see where it happened, like sort of where the lake and the land boundary existed. And there's clearly a group of these things that have been deliberately placed into the lake, perhaps even off the edge of the platform that leads out into it. So this speaks of sort of a careful veneration of the objects, perhaps their deposition at the end of their useful life, a particular connection to the deer species that are present here. The site, as I said, wasn't occupied for the full 800 years. It may not also have been occupied throughout the year. It might have been seasonally used, so perhaps in summer, maybe for hunting parties. It's even, that's another link that might suggest why these particular animal species were present and used at the site in such quantity. So Clark found 21 of these during his early excavations, again in the museums that I mentioned earlier, but the recent excavations found many more and in different types and different sizes. The ones that are in the case here are from the recent excavations at Starcar by the University of York. Now, so with these headdresses, which are really typical of Starcar, really incredibly important, becomes we go to a much smaller object, but much rarer. So the tiny thing that I'm holding in my hand is called the Starcar Pendant. So it's made of shale. It's only a couple of centimeters in length. You can see it's very thin. You can see sort of the lamination on it. And hopefully in the light, you'll be able to see there are a series of etchings. There are markings on the front of it. In the top corner here, there is a perforation. You can see it's been worked through in this sort of motion to create a hole in it. So that's been strung. This has been worn by somebody who lived at Starcar. Now, these markings on it, so they're all elongated scratches with some smaller scratches off the sides of each of them. These, we can tell archaeologically that they've happened in several phases. We don't know whether that phase was perhaps over one day or over its construction, or if it's got a much longer biography that may have lasted days, weeks, months, years, or even generations, with different people adding different markings to it over time. Again, we don't know exactly what these markings are for, but they might be related to the landscape. It could be some sort of map. It may even link to the platform that heads out into the lake. So it might be sort of reflective of the site where it was. We don't have, so that's the earliest evidence for Mesolithic art anywhere in Britain because of how early Starcar is. There's other evidence of this sort of scratch markings from other sites in Britain and particularly in Scandinavia as well, but not on shale and not in a pendant just like this. That is unique within the object. So hopefully those few things give you like a sense of what life was like a little bit on the edge of this lake in the Mesolithic period. I'm going to close by showing you, by commenting on sort of the preservation of the site as it is now. So between Clark's excavations in the 50s and Milner's excavations in the 2000s up to 2018, the site has fundamentally changed. So the soil condition has become, seen greater acidity within it. So the organic material that was preserved excellently in the 50s when it came out of the ground is in slightly poorer condition when it comes out of the ground now. So the site is deteriorating. During both these phases of excavation, everything hasn't been removed. There's still a significant part of the site and the settlement that has been left in ground, preserved in situ at the edge of the Paleo lake. But the condition of that in years to come is ultimately going to deteriorate now. Whether that's due to climate change or through agricultural practices, a mixture of both, it's not exactly clear, but the site is going to deteriorate. This means that the material that has been excavated already is really critically important for the understanding of the site, and it's beholden upon the museum to have it to be able to preserve it correctly. You'll have seen in the antler case on the side that it's preserved, that they're displayed in a smaller case within a larger case. This is because it's much easier to control the environmental conditions in that smaller space. So this acidification of the site has also introduced additional minerals into the bone that shouldn't be there. Particularly, there's a lot of sulfur. If that sulfur gets if it's in an environment that is too humid or too warm, it will start to oxidize, and that irreplaceable archaeology will start to be damaged irrecoverably. It will be gone. So we have to try and look after it as best that we can. Now, I have in front of me sort of to give you a sense of how this stuff is now preserved archaeologically. So these are 3 fragments of wood, all from a single context of the site. You'll be able to get a sense of that. It's got this beautiful dark colour to it, which comes from the organic nature of the sort of the PT deposits that they ended up in on the lake. And these have been worked, you can see, so this isn't just natural, so that's been cut down a little bit. I'm going to leave them in the bag here. But this is how we're trying to preserve this material now. So they are sealed in a polythene bag. Each of these 3 has got a little heat seal to make a little chamber for them individually. And they have some jiffy foam underneath them and an acid-free label with their information on it. So we can always be able to reconstruct where these things came from in the site. But the bags have also got a series of little holes that are cut within them. Because unlike the bone material, which we need to treat quite differently, the wood material, we have to be conscious not to have it in a microclimate. It needs to not get too sweaty and horrible. So it needs to be able to breathe a little bit to be able to preserve it. Now, The final object in here hopefully ties all this together a little bit. So we have what is an incredibly delicate object. I'm going to leave it in the bag. If you can see it on, hopefully you can see it on the image, on the film. So this little brown splodge is made of birch bark. You can see on the edge that it's been rolled up. So at some point in the 800 years history of this site, somebody at Starcar used perhaps one of their lithic tools or one of their different antler tools to go to a birch bark tree and peel this bark off it. It's an exploiting the natural resources. Birch bark is a very resinous sort of, is a very resinous material, and by rolling it up like this and sealing it with a bit of the sap, a bit of the resin, it creates a portable firelight. It's a very flammable material like this. It's an excellent little insight into what daily activity in this site in North Yorkshire more than 10,000 years ago, and it's only through the really unusual preservation of the site that we're able to get that sort of information. I hope that's been an interesting little jaunt through the site of Starcar. Have there been any questions?
Someone would like to know why the site is called Starcar.
It's a good question. The site is called Starcar because it's named after the farm where the site was discovered. A carr is a sort of a wooded area or a copse, and you'll find many of them throughout North Yorkshire in particular and kind of Yorkshire. It's a very Yorkshire word. There are lots of carrs. That's where it's from.
I think that's it. Lots of thank yous and lots of lovely comments.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you very much for listening to me. If anybody does have any further comments, do pop them in the chat and we'll hopefully be able to get to them later on. For now, the next Curator's talk will be on the 9th of March, again via Facebook Live, which is on some Iron Age, the Towton Talks. And the Yorkshire Museum will be reopening in April, and we hope to be able to see you all and these incredible objects on display back then. Thank you very much.